So I've already made a couple of videos on James Lindsay, and at this point, I'm getting very tired of his shtick because at this point, after having watched a couple of live streams by Auron Macintyre and a video by Academic Agent going over some of James Lindsay's absolutely schizophrenic tweets, I've realized that James Lindsay is a very deeply mentally ill and confused man. Either that, or, this is something I think is more likely, he's a very motivated and I think disingenuous actor who's trying to score blows against the political right and effectively to serve as a de-radicalization and diversion away from the right's true political goals. And these people like James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson are talking about this like global Marxist conspiracy. And Jordan Peterson has his maps of meaning and he's got his Jungianism. And they're talking about literally everything except stuff like white demographics. The only thing that actually really matters right now is white demographics and the way white people are being treated in society if you're like a white conservative person. But these people are just they absolutely insist on talking about everything but this. It's like a kind of issue distraction. And when watching his videos, something became very clear to me that wasn't clear before because, when I made my first video about James Lindsay and the woke right, I hadn't watched his talk on theoretical communism, where he delivers his theory of his sort of conspiracy theory about global power and all the influences behind people in the upper echelons of the global elite. Like he thinks that these people all have these like theosophical priors and that the world is essentially run by people who have a theosophical and spiritual variant of communism that's based on like the evolution of humanity into a single spiritual organism. And, this is just complete crazy talk. He has no proof of any of this. He has the most strained and poorly researched interconnections. It's like a string board. He's just putting up red string along all these different connections that he's come up with, trying to explain why people have some of these kooky ideas or why these kooky ideas show up in so many places. But ultimately, he doesn't have really any proof of any of this. And as an example of this, I looked up something he talked about called social emotional learning. Now, James Lindsay talks about the Fetzer Institute as if the Fetzer Institute had developed or invented this, but actually, social emotional learning was invented by a university professor in the 1960s as an attempt to address Black underachievement in schools. It was an attempt to address inequality because they believed that differences in socioeconomic status made it difficult for Black people or Black children to socialize and get along. So they thought that by teaching people intercommunication skills, this would resolve the problem and increase Black academic performance. Of course, for obvious reasons, that doesn't really work. And the role of the Fetzer Institute was actually just to fund it. It funded it in the 1990s. Now, he points out that there are these weird theosophical origins for the Fetzer Institute. I don't know anything about that. I haven't looked into it. Maybe it's true. It wouldn't be the first time that one of these globalist organizations has had some weird occult tendencies, like, for example, the Fellowship of New Life that I mentioned in my previous video. But really, I just wanted to point out how tenuous this connection between social emotional learning and the Fetzer Institute is. And this is really a synecdoche for the quality of James Lindsay's research in general. And so from watching Auron Macintyre, I began to get a real overall picture of the kind of person that James Lindsay is and what he believes. Now, James Lindsay, while criticizing the woke right for having believed that they've supposedly woken up to the real oppressors and the real conspiratorial political situation that the right is in, he complains about this while at the same time presenting his own woke conspiracy theory about global power. And he thinks that the left and the right and all the various power actors in society are colluding over these weird theosophical ideologies. So it turns out that James Lindsay himself is actually the most woke person in the room. And really, when he's complaining about the right coming up with theories about, why whites are so put upon and whites are so discriminated against and pathologized in society, he's really just projecting. The exact same thing he accuses the right of doing, of trying to push out conservatives and secure power for themselves, is, as Auron Macintyre points out, exactly what James Lindsay is doing, except for the political center. And Auron Macintyre and the Prudentialist also sort of get into something else, which is that they point out that James Lindsay is basically like a 1990s liberal leftist. And he has stated numerous times that his real enemy is the right. And he thinks the real political danger in the modern world is the right rather than the left. And of course, James Lindsay complains about the right coming up with these narratives about the reason why right-wing ideology is so pathologized in the modern world, like the post-war consensus and never again. He thinks this is like woke QAnon conspiratorial nonsense. Well, at the same time, as Auron Macintyre points out, his entire career is based on tracing the ideological lineage of sort of this post-Marxist woke phenomenon that pathologizes white people and straight males and Christians. And furthermore, something else about James Lindsay is that he has, in recent times, sort of delved into the domain of religion and spirituality, thinking symbolically and in correspondences and trying to uncover the occult roots of modern Marxism. But he himself is a new atheist, and he has written at least 2 books on why conservatives and Christians are stupid for believing on God, they're stupid for being Christian, and the superior future is supposed to be this rationalistic liberalism. He's kind of trying to worm his way into the right whilst being divisive himself. And so he said in his Bullets podcast, as I clipped in my previous video on the woke right, he says that the purpose of the woke right is to be divisive and to end true conservatism, or to disrupt the sort of mainstream conservative movement and prevent it from having any kind of success. But actually, when you look at it, this is exactly what James Lindsay is doing by trying to intervene himself between the right wing and the center. He's trying to worm himself into the political dialectic, a word that Lindsay likes to use a lot, dialectic. He's trying to worm himself inside of it, and he's trying to redefine and determine it. And that's the whole point of this woke right narrative. So I guess I've once again made a mistake that I make pretty frequently, which is that I like to imagine that other people who have ideas hold them seriously, that they're not just using them as Machiavellian power ideas, that they're not just engaging in motivated reasoning. I like to think that I don't engage in motivated reasoning. So the people I'm dealing with, I like to give them the charitable credit that they're not engaged in motivated reasoning either. And I try to address them on that foundation. But apparently I was wrong, and this is what I get for being so naive, that I made a collective 40 minutes of video about James Lindsay critiquing the specific points of things that he's actually said, when in reality, I should have done better to just have a broad overview of James Lindsay to recognize what his shtick is. He's an atheist, and he thinks that what he believes is rational, and everything else has to be irrational, like a religion. I pointed out in one of my videos, but that is what James Lindsay is, right? He's a new atheist. He thinks that liberalism is scientific and rational, and anything else is just kooky, crackpot religious nonsense. It really is that simple with James Lindsay. And, something about James Lindsay that I've been thinking about recently as well, which I've seen in other people who get into certain ideas, is that, there's certain ideas that if you're not prepared for them, they just kind of break your brain. And 2 of these ideas are occultism and Marxism. And James Lindsay has decided that he needs to study both of these. And, these things have negatively impacted him in the sense that when you study occultism is all about symbols and correspondences and the living reality of symbols as actual extant entities, even conscious entities. And so this view of things as analogies or correspondences has been very deeply ingrained into James Lindsay's mind as he's been studying occultism. And this has caused him to see connections between things that don't actually exist, like, for example, between Marxism and religion. I got into this when I was analyzing James Lindsay's view that Marxism is like Gnosticism. He thinks these things are the same because he just sees correspondences in them. But, correspondences don't necessarily mean things are connected. This is actually like a sign of schizophrenia, where you see correspondences between things that are perfectly innocuous and normal that don't have any causal relationship with each other. And that's exactly the case in James Lindsay's analysis of Gnosticism and Marxism. There's no causal or intellectual link between Gnosticism and Marxism at all, but he just finds this analogical correspondence, and so he asserts that that's true. Again, occultism has kind of broken his brain. And similarly, Marxism kind of breaks people's brains as well, because when you study Marxism and you learn about dialectics and you learn about class warfare, then suddenly you see dialectics in class everywhere. And this happens with a lot of people who read Marx without having any sort of priors about what Marxism is or how Marxism has turned out. You just look at the theory and the theory alone. You just sort of see this kind of theoretical overview applied to everything, right? You see it everywhere. You see class opposition everywhere. For example, the theory that nations are just an outgrowth of class ideology designed to exclusivize wealth and justify oppression. You just overlay this class theory onto literally everything that exists under the sun. It's your own personal grand unifying theory. So Marxism in that way kind of breaks your brain as well. So James Lindsay's brain has been broken twice by occultism and Marxism. He sees dialectics everywhere and he sees correspondences everywhere. And at no point has it ever occurred to him to actually contextually analyze these things and to take them on their own grounds, like to take them seriously as actual like rational ideologies. And something else I want to say about James Lindsay is that, he accuses the woke right of believing that they have some kind of epistemic privilege for having woken up to the hidden truth about society. But again, this is exactly what James Lindsay is doing by uncovering all these occult connections between different kinds of Marxism. He thinks that he now has epistemic authority to define what Marxism is in opposition to the way that Marxists define themselves. Now, of course, on Twitter, James Lindsay went on this schizophrenic tirade about how people like Auron Macintyre are part of like a conspiracy to derail the right and to introduce theosophy into mainstream politics. So he thinks there's this grand conspiracy in the woke right that there are these paid individuals and power actors who are controlled by the global elite who are trying to perform disinformation and basically just doing gay ops. But at the same time, you look at someone like James Lindsay, and he's getting funding from weird places, and he has this sort of incestuous relationship with intellectual dark web figures like people like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, and they're all kind of colluding together to make political change and to intervene and try to prevent the right from radicalizing. So who's doing the real gay ops here? Who is the real subversive? So because I don't think James Lindsay is necessarily an intellectually honest person, I'm not going to pursue any critiques of James Lindsay any further. I think my previous two videos are pretty comprehensive enough, and this one should pretty much be the final nail in the coffin as far as my view of James Lindsay is concerned.